It's a very great pleasure to welcome back to Oxford and to Oxford for the first time two very distinguished guests to round out the series that we've convened this term on global Southeast Europe in a multi-polar world. And we couldn't end on a more important subject than the rule of law, which we'll be talking about, European efforts broadly in relation to the region of Southeast Europe. And we have, to enlighten us this evening, two speakers who have very long and distinguished careers in diplomacy. So these are individuals who are speaking with tremendous relevant experience, I have to say. And we're going to start, I'll introduce them both, but we'll start with Pierre Mirel, who was director of the European Commission's DG Enlargement Unit for Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia and Kosovo, and is now happily retired, he tells me.
Yes.
And is associated with Sciences Po, among other things, and has just co-edited, is it, or co-authored, co-edited a volume on, in French, Géopolitique de la démocratisation, geopolitics of democratization. And as I said, he will speak first, followed by Erwan Fouere, who is an associate senior research fellow at CEPS in Brussels, the Center for European Policy Studies, and is also a mediator with CMI. This is Marti Atazari's outfit, and has been focusing in that regard on largely Ukraine, but has spent a lot of time working on Macedonia, and will be talking principally about the EU's role in that region. But I think it makes sense we start with Pierre Mirel, who give us a sort of broader picture, and then we come back with a more focused examination of issues relevant to Macedonia in particular. So, over to you. And thank you very much for
thank you. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you also for selecting this topic. I assume that you picked it up because you consider that rule of law promotion in the Western Balkans is an important issue. And so does the European Commission, which over the past 4 or 5 years, in its so-called strategy document that is released normally in October every year, has indicated that it was the first challenge. Rule of law in the wider sense. The wider sense, what I mean is basically what we put under Chapter 23, Judiciary and Fundamental Rights. That is judiciary, anti-corruption policies, rights, citizens' rights, rights of minorities, media freedom, role and freedom of civil society organizations, which in these states, weak states for some of them, if not all, and weak parliaments play an important, or should play an important role. This is the importance of rule of law is also confirmed by a very recent report which has been released in February by a group of NGOs which have constituted, I think 10 years ago, a group called CELDI. CELDI stands for Southeast Europe Leadership for Development and Integrity Initiative, a group of NGOs in the different in all the countries. And I'm just quoting two sentences. They consider that administrative corruption has become more important than ever, a mass phenomenon in the Western Balkans, and also that a tangible deterioration of assessment of perceived corruption among magistrates since 2001. It was, to my surprise, confirmed also by local politicians. I was last week with a group of 45 young so-called political leaders, half of them basically members of parliament from the different countries, different political parties. And when we started by asking the seminar on building democratic institutions, and the first workshop was, what do you consider yourselves as the main challenges for your country and for the region? And the first challenge they mentioned was rule of law. Although I guess for some of them they are part of the problems and not so much of the solutions, at least until now. So this is, I guess, why 2011, 4 years ago, the EU has adopted what is known now as the new approach on rule of law, complemented 2 years later, 2013, by a second sort of a fundamental topic, economic governance, and recently by putting the emphasis on public administration reform. And I would like to show here something which has been drawn up by Sigma being an OECD EU program on public administration, and for the first time listing very detailed requirements for a public administration reform that is really answering questions from all the countries, saying, well, it's fine, you're talking about, transparent, professional, civil service, etc. But how do you go from A to Z? And that's a very interesting document. You find it on the internet. Now, I would like to maybe recall, to start, developments between, let's say, political criteria adopted in Copenhagen 2003 and this new approach 2011. I guess you're familiar with the fact that in the fifth enlargement, there was no chapter, so-called chapter, in the accession negotiations on the rule of law. Political criteria, or the implementation of political criteria, was looked at and monitored in the so-called progress report published by the Commission every year. But there was no chapter in the negotiations, basically because there was no primary law. These criteria were political criteria, not enshrined in the treaty. As a result, I was looking back at some reports, Poland, etc. What we asked the Hungarians, Poles, in 98, 99 to do on judiciary was very limited. Just saying, you should speed up the proceeds and etc. Train your judges a bit better, but not any detailed requirements. So that's an important fact to recall. I was about to say as a result, probably not as a result, but nevertheless the level of corruption in some new member states is still very high. I mean, the Czech Republic is one of the highest, even higher than in Romania and Bulgaria, at least the perception by the population. Then another important issue after the 2004 was, of course, the accession of Romania and Bulgaria in conditions which were not exactly what people thought ideal conditions, and cooperation verification mechanism was put in place, in particular on the rule of law after accession. But you cannot expect from a post-accession mechanism to obtain what accession negotiations did not achieve. In the meantime, a very important development within the EU was the Stockholm program, with a number of measures to be adopted, mainly on migration, border management, asylum, etc., but also, for the first time ever, with the idea of looking at corruption and judiciary in the member states themselves, not just candidate countries. And in 2013-14, two reports were adopted on judiciary and on corruption. So these have been sort of lessons learned from the fifth enlargement, including later on with Croatia. For the first time ever with Croatia, a chapter was introduced on judiciary and fundamental rights, chapter 23, because in the meantime, Copenhagen criteria had been enshrined in the treaty, Article 2. But I think the mistake made was that this chapter 23 was opened very late in the accession negotiations, not at the beginning. And I think we will all agree that reforming judiciary is much more difficult than adopting and even enforcing an environmental directive, right? It's a question of mentality, not just of training a couple of judges. So these different lessons have led the Commission in 2011 to consider that a new approach should be adopted. And actually, it was the only way to get member states accepting to open accession negotiations to Montenegro. Otherwise, they would not have accepted if a specific approach had not been adopted on the rule of law. So that was proposed in October 2011, adopted by the Council in December. And I would like now to say a few words on this new approach. What does it mean, new approach? Well, my definition is that it's a new policy whereby rule of law related issues must be tackled first in the accession negotiations, based on action plans, listing clear and detailed requirements, with measurable track records, and this is an important word, with interim and closing benchmarks, and that's a very important element, where the reform speed in that particular chapter, 23, will condition the overall negotiation space. So if we, maybe a few words on each of these points. So from the 2012, when accession negotiations were opened with Montenegro, for the first time ever, 23 and 24 have been screened in the first place and should be opened before any other chapter. The reason is again to allow a maximum period of time for the country to reform. This approach has been followed with Montenegro and now with Serbia. And the second point is that the country has to draw up an action plan together with the Commission on the basis of the screening report, of looking at what's missing, weak points, and etc. That action plan must be adopted by the government, is then adopted by the member states, and this action plan is considered as the opening benchmark. In other words, once the member states accept the action plan, it means that the chapter is open to negotiations. And some interim benchmarks are fixed. So that, and the action plan include very detailed requirements. If you look at the action plan that Montenegro has adopted, you find it on internet, it's striking. The list of very precise, very clear requirements which are indicated. The important element, as I mentioned before, is also that the accession negotiations in the other chapters will not move forward unless there is progress on the implementation of the action plan, chapter 23. That's what they call imbalance clause. And that's a very important point because if no progress is made on judiciary, then the overall negotiations will not move forward. I would like maybe to mention two examples from the action plan Montenegro. On the judiciary, an initial track record that assets reported by magistrates, they have the obligation to report on their assets, are duly checked and that sanctions are applied in case of non-compliance. In other words, it's not just mandatory to report on assets, but there must be a track record of what happened. Did all magistrates report it on their assets? If not, or if something happened in the meantime, magistrate paid a couple of hundreds of euro in Montenegro, all of a sudden buying a wonderful villa by the seaside, there must be something wrong. So it's with an investigation, etc. And an example on fight against corruption, and I think that would be the most important and interesting one, an initial track record of efficient and effective investigation prosecution, court rulings in corruption cases, including high-level cases, should be established. That led a prime minister in the region to say, basically, you mean that unless I'm in jail, there will be no progress with Chapter 23. I don't know. But this is something which I will not say all the member states, but at least an important group of member states will take that very seriously, this track record element before moving forward. Now, so it's a new sort of tool, right, which has been adopted for rule of law promotion. Is it a strong tool? I would say yes. I think it's a turning point in the sense that for the first time ever, and certainly as compared to fifth enlargement, it is striking that very clear requirements are not just you should make sure that your judiciary become transparent, professional, etc., but very detailed requirements are listed. With the imbalance clause, which is sort of guarantee that reforms will be undertaken. But of course, that applies only to countries which are in accession negotiations, right? So the others, not yet. So the leverage for reforms before accession negotiations are opened remain, in my view, a bit weak. And this is why, at least that's my personal position, I'm pleading for asking all the countries, whether they are in accession negotiations or not, to prepare action plans, to get these action plans adopted by the government, so that the reforms could start early on the basis of this list of clear requirements. So I think it reinforces the normative power of the EU on the rule of law, because in a sense these requirements are considered as norms. Now you could say, but how can the EU come up with these kind of norms on environment or agriculture? Yes, because you have directive, it's EU legislation. In these fields, there is no EU legislation. True, these requirements have been based primarily on European Convention on Human Rights, jurisprudence of the court, Venice Commission in particular, which has on many different positions established a kind of jurisprudence, I would say parallel jurisprudence on judiciary, and best practices. But at the same time, as we, I think, know very well, EU transformative power is effective only if not just the political elite, but also civil society at large, in a sense, would become owner of the reforms. And this is where the civil society organizations have a key role to play. In Montenegro, they have associated, upon the pressure of the Commission, civil society organizations to join up the action plan. I'm not sure that they will ask the NGOs to be closely associated to the monitoring of the action plan. Well, I don't know. It remains to be seen. In Serbia, they are also associating the NGOs to preparing the action plan. But unless they do that, unless there is not just the government, but political elite in the wide sense, and civil society, who would in a sense buy these requirements and make sure that they are respected, then of course reforms won't happen. But this is not new. This is for all the different issues. So this is, I think the weakness is probably in two ways. First, without a proper public administration reform, I don't think that you can succeed in reforming judiciary and the other elements that of the administration that really matter in terms of rule of law. This is why these principles of public administration are important. But there is no chapter on that. These working groups have been set up with the different countries, but the leverage is less than having a proper chapter in the negotiations. And that may have to be established one day. And second, I think one should push more strongly for NGOs to really be part of the process and not limit these action plans and reforms to a small political circle in the country. Sort of four pillar that, in my view, is missing. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Before I move over to Erwan, I just want to ask, why do you think there was insufficient appreciation earlier for the importance of rule of law? I mean, you contrasted, it's quite a stark contrast from the fifth enlargement to what we see later. Is it how the challenge manifested itself in these later countries that are on the road to accession, or is it learning from the mistakes of not having emphasized it sufficiently earlier?
Learning certainly from the mistakes, but I think there is another element. I don't know if my colleagues here if Graham will agree, but I think there was at the time during the fifth enlargement there was sort of naivety. We were naive.
In what
Let's
sense?
be frank. In the sense that there was such a wide consensus in Poland, Hungary, all the countries, a strong political determination to do what we are asking the countries to do. The quicker the better, to join the EU, and there was sort of belief that everything would be done, and returning to Europe was kind of motto, and etc. So there was that element. And I think we are certainly underestimating the lack of proper reform of administration and judiciary problems and etc.
Okay. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted. Actually, I do remember now, as a postgraduate student, I did visit Oxford before Ireland and the UK became members of the European community, as it then was. But it's a great pleasure to be here and to see good friends from the past, and also I'm very honoured to share this platform with Pierre. On this very topical issue at the moment in the Balkans, and also I'd like to thank Jesse, who had the idea of inviting and that. So, well, my experience in all of this is very much from the rock face, because I spent 9 years in the Balkan countries. My last posting before retiring from the European Union was in Macedonia as the EU Special Representative and the head of delegation there from 2005 to 2011. So I was just towards the end of the when the Commission was transforming its approach and putting the rule of law at the heart of the accession process, which I can only echo what Pierre had said on the rationale for this, because particularly when you're dealing with the Balkans, these are all post-conflict societies, which is something we tend to underestimate sometimes, the impact of working for institutional reform in post-conflict societies that have not yet put the past to rest, and there's still a lot of issues of accountability and that relating to the past that have not been dealt with. Just like in Northern Ireland also, we're still facing problems of the past. But the focus on the rule of law, and not in the sense of a sort of institutional grand design, but rather a whole interconnected set of values which relate to democracy, to freedom of the media, to functioning of the political institutions, the parliament, functioning of the economy, level playing field, etc., etc. These are all part of this rule of law focus. So it was a very, very welcome initiative on the part of the European Commission and the European Union. But now we are 3 years down the road after that new approach, and unfortunately the picture in the Balkans is extremely bleak. And if you look at the last progress reports on the countries in the region, it's a list of some of the worst possible ills that are affecting society, starting with the very high levels of corruption and all the other issues relating to lack of judicial independence, lack of freedom of the media, public administration which is highly politicized. So it raises the question as to where does the fault lie with this? Certainly the fault lies with the countries themselves, a lack of political will, vested interests, the sort of elites who are quite happy with being able to continue with their illegal activities, cross-border crime, etc., and are not very keen to see any rule of law reforms being pushed by the European Union, and linked to very populist nationalist tendencies that still exist. So that's on one hand, but also on the other side, I think you have to look at the European Union as bearing some of the responsibility. First of all, because the EU's leverage has weakened considerably. There's no doubt about it. And if you look at the current situation particularly in Macedonia, in Bosnia Herzegovina, which are the two countries which are the black holes, so to speak, in the Balkan region at the moment, the European Union has really not been able to impose its will as it used to be, as used to do. So that's an issue which has a direct impact on the performance of the countries concerned. And also we have to say, unfortunately, enlargement is no longer the popular support that it had in the past, even though it's the most successful foreign policy that the European Union developed by a long chalk, but it's not a popular issue in public opinion, and you won't have many politicians in the EU countries, not even in the UK, who will praise the enlargement. And they will, of course, link this to issues that are very toxic, such as increased immigration, the dangers of increased immigration, etc. So that's affecting, there's no doubt about it, the margin of maneuver and the leverage of the European Union. And then also we have some member countries who are not giving the best example, such as Hungary. And where the European Union either does not have the political will or does not have the institutional mechanisms to address that, although they do, because from the legal point of view, they can suspend voting rights of a country that does not respect. But this is the nuclear option, which will probably never be used. But there's no doubt that the track record of some of the EU member countries is also affecting the capacity of the European Union to transform the power, the transformative power that it had in the past to promote change in those countries in the Balkan region. And the other aspect which I think is important in the Balkan region is that no longer is the EU the only player in the region. Russia is assuming a much more assertive role in the Balkans, and we all know why, of course. There are no natural resources that are of interest to them, but it's purely a useful tool in the foreign policy approach of Putin's role on the international arena. Imagine that in Macedonia, which is a country that'll so small it'll fit into your pocket, a population of 2 million people, but it produces more problems than the whole region itself. The Russian embassy has increased its staff in the last 6 months by 25%. And they're all Russian diplomats. They're not local, all Russians. And there have been occasions when government ministers or journalists would invoke the role of Russia in debates and so on to counter the approach of the European Union. So this is something that a European Union needs to bear in mind and will no doubt have to will affect the way it operates. What more can the EU do? Well, certainly, I think that there needs to be, in my view, a much more, even more prescriptive approach of the European Union. Pierre very eloquently emphasized the roadmaps, the track records and everything. But there needs to be some more effective way of ensuring that that track record really means something. In other words, if a particular legislation is adopted which relates to reforms on public administration or things like that, where civil society should be consulted, of course, and where, because that's part of the approach, the criteria set by the European Union, and also that there should be sufficient financial and human resources to ensure effective implementation. And if you look at the last progress reports, you will see for some of the countries, like Bosnia, like Macedonia, where several items of legislation, for example on anti-discrimination, which have a body established to implement the policies provided for by the law, they can't operate because they don't have sufficient financial resources. Similarly with agencies on minority rights and things like that. So I think that that's an example where the EU needs to assume a much more muscular, much more determined, intrusive role than it has up to now. And the other two important aspects, I think, that Pierre mentioned is ensuring not just a token involvement of civil society, but a really very, very active involvement. A little bit like, it's not beyond the bounds of impossibility, because Slovenia, during its accession process, they had a very sensible approach. They had a core negotiating team, which included representative political parties, civil society, business community, etc. So you really had a nucleus of the country, and all the negotiating positions were the country's position, in other words, the whole country. So there was a sense of ownership in what was being proposed in the negotiating process. And that also made sure that there was a level of information of the public much higher than you have in other countries. So that's something that needs to be done much more in countries where it's not usual. Serbia has also an important civil society, but they're not necessarily involved or being consulted. And then the other important aspect is the media, because you have a situation in the Balkans where the record is extremely bad. The OSCE Representative Freedom of Media has highlighted on many occasions the very negative record. And then, of course, the Reporters Without Borders Index, the last one that came out, classifying all the countries according to very clear criteria. For example, they put Macedonia, which was in 34th place in 2009. Now it is in 129th place, so just above Angola. But of course, the Prime Minister doesn't care. He said he doesn't believe these reports, assessments, and things like that. So, but again, there is where the EU really needs to do much more on supporting the media, supporting investigative journalism, to ensure better accountability, because this is something which is lacking, and this links up also with the whole rule of law aspect. If you don't have proper oversight and accountability control over the government, they do what they want. And this brings me to the quite dramatic situation in Macedonia, which in 2005 was regarded as a success story, because it had emerged a few years before from a bloody interethnic conflict. There was an agreement brokered by the international community, the Ohrid Framework Agreement, and which provided for special rights, linguistic rights for the ethnic Albanian community, which represents 25% of the population, as well as the other minorities that are existing in Macedonia, like the Roma, the Serbs, the Vlachs, the Bosniaks, and a number of other representational rights for minorities. So all of those changes were conducted, were adopted, and the country was granted candidate status in 2005. But then in 2006 we had a change of government with the Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, who is still now Prime Minister, and who has embarked on he started off on a very, very welcome program of economic reforms, fight against corruption, but we quickly saw that behind that there was an ethno-nationalist populist agenda, which was absolutely clear that their whole focus was on pushing this agenda, and the EU agenda took second place. And now we have this scandal of wiretapping in operation, which has been masterminded by the Prime Minister, wiretapping on an industrial scale of over 20,000 people, including judges, politicians, foreign diplomats, including myself, and many others. And the Prime Minister has tried to suggest that this is all engineered by foreign intelligence, and he has accused the leader of the opposition who released this information of espionage. And just to show you how the separation of powers works in Macedonia, he ordered the arrest, not him, but he ordered the prosecutor to arrest the leader of the opposition. His passport was removed, and regardless of who is responsible for those wiretapping, the content is absolutely appalling. It's the worst possible examples of corruption, of rigging of elections, where the Ministry of Interior issues voting cards to several hundred voters coming across from Albania, paying their trip, registering them in a 50-meter apartment in Skopje, and making them vote in the Centaur municipality, which is the only municipality run by opposition leader. I mean, awful things, and of course language which wouldn't be out of place in a banana republic. And the Prime Minister is, in a normal country, he would be made he would resign, but unfortunately we're dealing with a country where all the control lies in the hand of the government. I appealed to the EU for the Commissioner Hahn, who was due to go for his first visit to Skopje, that they should not go, but unfortunately he went, and he made very bland, anodyne statements, basically almost accepting whatever the Prime Minister told him. It's only when he returned to Brussels that he was much more critical, but he should have said that in Skopje. And my point there is that the EU has not been strong enough in its approach towards Macedonia, and has given license to the Prime Minister to act with such impunity, and that he can get away with anything. And now, of course, there is a lot of concern expressed by various people, but the Prime Minister is not someone to give in, and with his back to the wall, he will fight to the bitter end, even though it's quite clear that the government has lost all credibility and should resign, and that there should be some sort of transition process. But unfortunately, the EU's appetite for what it might call interference in the internal affairs of a country is not very high. And the Prime Minister knows that. So I'm not sure how this will end up, but definitely the change is only possible with the pressure from the international community. So to conclude, I would just say that I think the approach of the European Union on rule of law is a very critically important one, but the method of implementation needs to be revisited when we're talking about the Balkan region, and there needs to be a much more determined approach, a change also in the language of the progress reports, which have become so bureaucratic and technical and for what is really a political exercise. And hopefully that will ensure that the EU at least can regain some of the leverage that it has lost in the reform process in the Balkan region. And of course, and further afield, when we're dealing with Ukraine also, where it is a country which is extremely weak, where the institutions are very, very weak. And there the EU really needs to think very carefully of how it can help Ukraine to reach that stage of transformation that it can prevent it from becoming a failed state. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very much. Two very bleak, if I may say, overviews of the situation, the challenge. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that rule of law is so important to the European Union. The European Union is perceived in some ways to be a beacon for the rule of law globally, and yet within its own backyard, struggling now, especially in Southeast Europe, as you've both indicated, with declining leverage. And I wanted, if we could, before I open to questions, just to pause for a moment and ask you to reflect a little bit more just on that challenge, because I mean, you both identified possible avenues for bringing greater pressure to bear. Some of them are indigenous. So you've talked about civil society, you've talked about the media and investigative journalism. We had a seminar workshop, day-long workshop on Bosnia Herzegovina, which Jesse, Dave Madden were very much involved in organizing at the end of January. And
Yes, I saw the report.
You saw the report. And this was an issue that arose in that context as well. You know, every case is different. Bosnia-Herzegovina is probably has a historically weaker civil society than some of the other former republics of Yugoslavia have had, but not necessarily weaker than Macedonia. But the issues that we identified there, the issues that relate to what you're talking about now, investigative journalism. I mean, there are penalties. Journalists who uncover or seek to uncover risk the wrath of the law being brought down on them, or their careers damaged, even destroyed. Civil society isn't accustomed to being assertive in the same way, perhaps, that it is in other. So, if we're talking about strengthening, and we do have to do that, the domestic institution, that we're talking about a very long time for these transformations to occur. What are the real possibilities that the
on Bosnia and Herzegovina precisely? Of course, the UK-German initiative was a welcome one, which was then endorsed by the EU in December and by the High Representative Mogherini. But my personal feeling is that it doesn't go far enough. It talks about the economic reforms and getting the leadership in Bosnia to adopt this joint declaration, find common points of interest and so on like that. But it needs to go much deeper. Already 10 years ago, the International Commission on the Balkans very clearly stated that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a dysfunctional state. So it's not working. So there has to be a new constitutional approach. So this initiative will only go so far. There needs to be a much more radical approach, and which would involve all the different sectors of society. And civil society is active, because last year or 2 years ago, I think you had all these demonstrations.
Exceptionally,
That really, and they were not ethnically divided, they were across the board.
Yeah.
So there is a potential there, given the outlet. They just need to be supported much more. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are dealing with post-conflict societies where the role of civil society is probably even more important, because they fill the gap of weak institutions and they act as a pressure point. I think there's more potential of civil society in the Balkan region, bearing in mind history and all that, than, for example, in Ukraine, where there is no tradition of involving civil society or anything like that. So this national dialogue idea now, which we've been doing a bit of work on with CMI, it's a huge problem, because there is not that natural approach of looking at the different constituents in a community and how to bring them on board. It's all about the elites.
Right. That's what they're used to.
On Bosnia Herzegovina, I'm not sure that the approach should be a constitutional reform. This has been tried several times over the past 15 years. It did not work. I would say, instead of trying once more, maybe that's through the economy. Every year, in October, November, Bosnia is basically bankrupt, right? And it's the IMF coming again with a new loan to help repaying the previous loans and paying salaries of civil servants. And I think leverage is very strong if the IMF actually would not do that. The IMF has a totally different approach in Bosnia as compared to Serbia, at least over the past years. And I think that there's possibility here to play more strongly, saying we are going to help you once more, but then reforms have to be done, otherwise we don't do it. And that would help certainly with privatization, state-owned companies that consume a large part of the budget. Why? Because political parties place their people who don't have an office in these companies. They just receive salary. Rule of law. So that I would say, starting with economic issues would be maybe the better approach. But I don't think that the commitment that the Parliament has made recently is going to lead to not just another, for the first time, signed, all right, but so what? But talking about responsibility of the EU, there's a country which we have not mentioned, that's Kosovo. There's very difficult situation these days, including corruption cases or alleged corruption within the EU rule of law mission, ULEX. And of course that, people are laughing at when we try to preach rule of law reforms and etc. And that happens within the EU organization itself. I think the mistake for me is to give executive power to an EU mission, to external mission. Teaching, coaching, training judges and etc. fine, but replacing local judges in an environment like the one in Kosovo, where you become native, maybe a few months later, and are subject to all kinds of pressure. I don't think it can work, and that's you can see that today.